All right, I think we can get started. First, I want to welcome everybody to another installment of Webinars for Busy Lawyers. We're happy to have you here. My name is Amy Levine. I'm the Director of Programs and Volunteers, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, A Hidden Health Crisis, Combating Loneliness in the Legal Profession. And before I introduce our presenter, Dr. Healy, I want to remind you what LCL offers. We provide a range of confidential services to support the legal community's well-being, including one-on-one consultations for mental health and substance misuse concerns, peer support groups, educational programs, and consultations on law firm practice management and ethics. And let me now introduce Dr. Shawn Healy. He is the Director of Administrative Operations and a licensed clinical psychologist on the clinical staff here at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. In his clinical role, he provides individual consultations and groups to law students, lawyers, judges, and legal professionals. He regularly presents and publishes on all manner of mental health topics germane to the legal community. He serves on the Massachusetts SJC Standing Advisory Committee on Professionalism, as well as on the Massachusetts Bar Association's Lawyer Wellbeing Committee. He is also the co-author of the book, The Full Weight of Law, How Legal Professionals Can Recognize and Rebound from Depression. He has been with LCL, I can happily now say, for over 10 years. And at the end of the presentation, we would love to hear from you and answer any of your questions. Please use the Q&A feature for those questions. And let's begin, and I will hand that off to Dr. Healy.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So, yeah, we're here to talk about loneliness, which is recently deemed an epidemic by the U.S. Surgeon General. And just to give sort of a starting point, I think it's helpful to talk about like what do we talk about when we're talking about loneliness? Because it's different than being alone. I often say, like, and others have said, you can be alone in a group. It's not the experience of being outside of social contact with others. It's something different than that. The Surgeon General offers this definition: a subjective, distressing experience that results from perceived isolation or inadequate, meaningful connections, where inadequate refers to the discrepancy or unmet need between an individual's preferred and actual experience. And I think it's helpful to take a moment with this definition, because it's helpful to sort of assess your own sense of loneliness. Not everyone feels lonely all the time, but it's particularly helpful to know for you, what is that experience of loneliness like? And one of the reasons why this is important is because sometimes people have an idea of what my connections should look like, right? If someone asks you, oh, how many friends do you have? That might not be meaningful to you. Right. For somebody else, that might be meaningful. But for you, like, what is it that sort of contributes to your loneliness? And we're going to talk about some sort of common contributing factors. But it's really important for you to have a sense for yourself of like, when is loneliness an issue for me? What factors contribute to my sense of loneliness? What helps me feel more connected and hence less lonely? And what works for one isn't necessarily going to work for another. So like most programs that I do, I always try to give a warning, which is I'm going to suggest a bunch of things at the end or towards the end. Don't do all of them, because doing everything, one, might not be helpful at all because it might not be applicable to you. The other is it's more important to pay attention to what is personally meaningful to you. If something sticks out to you as like, oh, that either makes sense, or it sounds like I should try that, or that might be meaningful, stick with that, go with it, try it out. And then if others, that works, great. If not, then, feel free to try something else. So I'm just noticing, I'm going to pause here. I'm noticing now my words are being translated onto the screen, which has never happened to me before. I'm sorry if you're seeing that and that's distracting. I'm going to
I,
go on
s-
though.
yeah, I see that too. I will try to not have it distract you.
Okay, thanks. All right. So, in terms of the effects of loneliness, part of the Surgeon General's report was about how loneliness affects us. So there are physical effects of loneliness. So it increases our risk of heart disease by 29%. It increases our risk of stroke by 32%. Dementia risk increases for older adults by 50%. And then premature death also increases by over 60%. And one comparison that they make is that lacking social connection is as unhealthy as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So we often don't think of it as like a personal health issue where, it might be like, oh, a quality of life issue or like a preference. But no, it actually has real physical and health implications when we're not adequately meeting our connection needs, our relationship needs. In addition to physical effects, it also has mental health effects. So feeling loneliness can affect feelings of depression, right? Feeling the weight of the things that we're carrying more acutely, right? We can feel more isolated. We can feel the effects in ways like not feeling as interested in things that we used to be interested in, not feeling as motivated. It also can affect us in the opposite way in terms of anxiety, right? Our fears might be heightened, right? Our sense of calm and peace might be compromised. And then another effect that's often overlooked is uh, with lacking relationships and connections, we miss out on social mirroring or social reference. So, for example, the quick example of this that I thought of was when I drive in the morning to drop off kids at school, there's certain traffic patterns that I assume are going to be there. If suddenly I I drive out on the commute and the traffic patterns are totally different, my first thought is, did I miss something? Like, is it a holiday today? Like, there's no traffic when there should be, right? Like, did I miss the memo? And so there are very subtle things that we just rely on other people to provide for us. And so when those relationships aren't there, when that social mirroring isn't there, that connectedness is missing, it can affect us in a subtle way at times or a more obvious way. Right? So things like maybe more relevant is like starting a new job, right? You started at a firm and you have this sense of like, I don't know what the expectations are, right? So if I can't see or observe other people, right? If I don't have those connections, either in person or remotely, I don't know what to expect. I don't know sort of what's normal here, right? And so that social reference point is really important. So this is not uh, an exhaustive list. These are some common contributors to loneliness. One is, I think a big one is technology, right? And technology is a double-edged sword, as many people have experienced. So on one hand, technology can actually make it easier for us to connect with people all around the world. It's like, great, I can have a video call. I can, be tweeting to somebody across the world. I can make relationships that way. Isn't that great? Sure. The flip side of that is technology can uh, provide a convenience that takes away a need for a relationship, right? So, for example, um, later on, I'm going to ask, some questions about like how do you know if you're lonely, or in what ways you could be experiencing loneliness. Um, Years ago, one of the things that would often be asked in terms of sort of judging the quality of your relationships with people is like, who would you call if you needed a ride to the airport, right? Who would you call if you were sick and you needed food brought over? So this is obviously before all the technological advances we have today where, well, I don't need to call anybody that I know. I can Uber a ride to the airport. I can call DoorDash to get food delivered. All right. So again, technology has this ability to both connect us to a broader world, but also isolate us locally. So that's something to be aware of. A big contributor recently was the pandemic. Literally, like being separated from people around us in order to shelter in place, to quarantine, to work remotely if you hadn't done that before. Lots of routines were disrupted, new routines were created. And so those rapid changes, multiple changes across the board, had ripple effects, and it affected our routines, our relationships, and our connections. Some people worked remotely prior to the pandemic. A lot more people work remotely now. And so, again, this is a double-edged sword, right? Working remotely can be convenient, can help me do work without a commute. It can help me meet with people at various distances, but also it removes me from that in-person contact that I used to have. And so uh, that can be a contributing factor. Another one is lacking accessible peers. So whether you are a remote law student, right, and you feel like, I don't have access to my peers, or you're a solo practitioner and you feel like, well, I'm doing this by myself, right? I don't have other peers in my office. It's just me. So I don't have those sounding boards or those relationships. Judges often talk about this, law firm partners. The more that you have responsibilities that you feel like you can't share with other people, right? There's this inherent sense of isolation. Or if just overwhelmed with work. A lot of lawyers, a lot of legal professionals just have a lot to do, right? We're busy people. We have a lot to do. We can be overwhelmed with work. And so when our attention is put on doing a lot of work, our attention cannot be directed towards other things. We have to make decisions and sacrifices. So what often happens is I'm trying to get my work done. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Therefore, I don't feel like I have the bandwidth to dedicate energy and time to relationships, to connections. And I can just by a result feel isolated and alone and lonely. Also, if you're just working with other people who are overwhelmed with work, right? That overwhelm takes people away, their attention away. Those connections get disconnected. Another thing that's very common is the skill of relationship building starts to get neglected over time. So if you just think back to, childhood, growing up, most likely you were in settings with same age peers, right, through school, where you had a ready population for potential friends and connections. And so like structures that you were in provided that for you. And so you had opportunity to make friends, to make connections. And then as time goes on, those structures start to fall away. After law school, starting to practice, your structure then might be your workplace because you spend a lot of time there. But your pool of making those relationships is smaller. And also the time that you have available to practice making friends starts to go down. So we can often just sort of lose our ability or our sharpness in being able to navigate new friendships, make new friendships. Another common one for lawyers is the issue of confidentiality and also the traumatic material that you might be exposed to working with clients with trauma histories. And so when you feel like I have to keep these things in confidence, and oftentimes you feel this sense of disconnection. I can't share this with other people. If you feel like what I'm dealing with at work, my stress involves traumatic material, it also might be that I don't want to put that on somebody else, like a loved one or my friends. And so by result, sometimes we don't share important stuff about our day, and hence we are carrying these burdens by ourselves. And then there's also polarization in society. right? When there are hot button topics, political, geopolitical, hot button issues that seem like you have to be on one side or the other. There's no nuance in between, but I feel some nuance. Sometimes it can feel like I don't feel comfortable sort of letting people know who I truly am or what I truly believe, because it might not fit into a category that I feel like I'm being pushed towards. So all of these things and others sort of make it really challenging to make new connections, to maintain current connections, and so forth. So I mentioned technology pros and cons, right? So again, we're using technology right now. Hopefully this is helpful. But my encouragement to you is to think about how much you use technology, right? And like, to what extent are you looking for that technology to meet a need? And then on the flip side of that, like, what are the cons of using that technology? And how can you address those cons, right? Obviously, technology is convenient, right? It helps us be more efficient, connects us to a wider world, right? But we don't want to ignore the cons. The fact that we need fewer people to do the things that we need to do. So we need less connection. So how am I going to compensate for that? So that technology that connects us to the wider world often makes us less connected to our local world. So if you've ever had the experience of, you know, living in a town or a city and thinking, or someone asking you, have you ever met your neighbors? Do you know the names of your neighbors? And oftentimes when people ask me that at various times in my life, I would have to say, like, no, I've never met my neighbors. Or maybe I know one neighbor on the entire block, right? So sometimes we can sort of neglect our local experience, people in our day-to-day life, in service of connecting with people far away. And so, again, just be aware of those cons and be thinking about, how can I compensate for those cons? How can I assure or figure out how I can have those connections that I need if connections with people far away aren't adequate for me personally, then a real local connection is what's going to be more helpful to me. How can I pursue that with intention and with dedicating some energy to it? So part of that Surgeon General's report and other reports have referenced overall, like, community involvement has gone down over the decades. Right? So the first stat here on the slide is that in 1999, about 70% of people surveyed belonged to some religious community, church, a synagogue, a mosque. You skip ahead about 21 years, in 2020, only 47% of people surveyed said that they belong to a religious community. And so obviously there's some shifts there in people's habits of being connected to a religious community. Part of that might be just a change in religious views. But what often happens is when we're involved in a community for a particular reason, let's say a religious belief or conviction, if that changes and we leave, we often, sometimes we don't realize what else that involvement was providing for us, right? So those connections, that community is super important. So if you've ever moved to a new location, a new city, a new state, and you realize that, oh, I don't have these communities that I'm used to. I don't have those connections anymore. It can be really difficult sometimes to find entry points into a community that feel like I have those connections again. And then just to put a finer point on this, even before the pandemic, in 2018, only 16% of Americans reported feeling very attached to their local community. So if you've ever sort of noticed your local community, your town, your city, and then suddenly realize, like, oh, my community is doing this thing this weekend, I had no idea. Or someone tells you, oh, have you ever heard about this program that the town or the city is doing? Right? It's really common for people to live in a place and to sort of see that as, well, that's my home base, but where I spend my time and energy is somewhere else. Right? So one idea, one recommendation is just be thinking about your local community. What's there, right? What services are there? What opportunities are there? and then just get reintroduced to your local community. So I mentioned that assessing your personal experience of loneliness is really important, right? So one way to do this would be to start by asking yourself, who would you tell about your good news? If something really good happened to you, like who would you go and tell? Would that be the same person that you tell about a tough day or a strange experience? Like, whoa, this strange thing happened to me. I got to tell somebody, right? If your first or only response to those questions is, well, maybe I'd post it. I'd post it on my social media page, or I'd text it or something like that. I just sort of put it out there to the world. That's a different experience than having people in your life where you feel like, oh, I would have these people that I would share this news with, right? Because of those connections that I have, right? The other thing to consider is, okay, what your personal optimal level of connectedness is. For some people, like they thrive with a big group of friends, right? They thrive with multiple connections, being able to talk to people, get into the weeds of their lives. I've talked to people who mentioned, oh yeah, I call my family 3 times a day, or I call my mom 3 times a day, and they're adults and their mom lives somewhere else. And for others, like, that sounds strange. Like, I call my mom once a month or once every 2 months or whatever. There's no right number of connection points with the relationships that you have. It's really about, for you, what is your optimal level of connectedness? And do you feel like you have the ability to maintain that optimal level of connectedness? And when you're feeling lonely, that's usually a sign that you're not at that optimal level. And if you could figure out some options for how to get towards that optimal level, then you're going to feel like you have a little more agency in making your experience and your relationships better. And then another thing to ask yourself is, how comfortable do you feel, or how capable do you feel in making new connections, right? Going back to that idea that our friend-making skills can get rusty. This happens for a variety of reasons, right? For older adults, it's often the case that their social networks start to pass away, right? Their friends, their loved ones start to die, and they feel like, oh, I have fewer and fewer connections. But if I haven't kept up with how to make new connections, it can feel very isolating. This is not just true for people who are older. This could be true for people who are younger, right? Again, if you have primarily relied on the structures that you've been in to provide you those opportunities, suddenly outside of those structures, it can feel really disorienting. It's like, now I don't know, like, how do you make a friend, or how do you get a relationship? How do you start forming these things? So these are just some questions to ask yourself. And then in terms of, like, how do you know when you're not lonely? That might sound like a strange question to ask. Another way of thinking about it is, what are the elements of connectedness? Right? What are you looking for? So you're not, my recommendation is, when you're thinking about making connections that are meaningful, it's helpful to know exactly what is important to me. What am I looking for? So here's a non-exclusive or exhaustive list about how you can feel connected. One is non-judgmental acceptance, right? Being able to talk to somebody, right, and know that you're going to be accepted. You're not going to be judged, right? That's important. Being able to be vulnerable in a relationship, right? That is very important. Some of the things that get in the way of vulnerability, particularly in the legal community, it's like the adversarial nature of law, right? Whenever we feel like I have to be on guard, I have to sort of put my best face forward all the time, I have to be invulnerable, right? That goes against the sense that vulnerability is important, it's valuable, it's essential. Okay, in relationships, vulnerability is essential, because that's how people get to know you. That's how you get to know other people. That's how you have a sense that, oh, someone really knows me and cares about me, because they know about my vulnerabilities as well as my strengths and interests. So obviously those relationships have to have a level of trust and safety in order to feel like I can be vulnerable. One of the common experiences among law students and lawyers, particularly in competitive environments, is the imposter syndrome. This is when I feel like everybody else knows more than I do. Everybody else has it worked out except for me. And I need to to hide the fact that I'm the imposter, I don't belong, right? That's the opposite of feeling trust and safety in those relationships where I can be honest about my shortcomings, my strengths, everything about me. Other elements are shared values, right? Feeling valued yourself and also feeling a part of something bigger than yourself. So again, they might seem idealistic, might seem out of reach at times, but these are some things to be aware of. So some strategies to combat loneliness. One is, again, to start with that awareness, your mindfulness, like what is helpful to me? What is my personal optimal level of connectedness? Next is recognize what barriers exist for you, right? Is it that I don't know many people? Is it that I've not been practicing my friend making skills? Is it technology? What are those barriers that you need to address? Next, do a self-inventory. Like what qualities, interests, values do you hold that you want to connect with others about, right? So a somewhat related idea, I've talked to people who are like interested in forming romantic relationships. Like I want a partner. And I often ask, like, what's important to you? And they might list, a bunch of things. And I say, where are you looking for those people in this world? And then, they might say, I want someone who's, really into nature and like values the environment. Where are you looking for them? I go to my neighborhood bar. I'm like, okay, well, you might want to look for those people in a location that you'd expect those people to show up to increase your odds. So if you know what qualities and values and interests are important to you, then you can start to look for groups, community, associations, or places that those type of people might be frequenting. Also explore where you might find others who share those qualities, right? So again, if what's important to you is an interest or hobby, or something in terms of community involvement, right? Start to explore where you might find them. Another is to use technology to improve your connectedness locally, right? So my smartphone, like yours, often will provide you with local options, right? So if we take the technology that we're used to using to connect us to the wider world, but intentionally focus it on our local world, that's one way of using one of those pros to address one of the cons. And also consider creating a space for people to connect. Oftentimes we feel like if I can't find the place that fits me, then I don't have an option for it. But one option might be to create it yourself and invite people in. One of the things about loneliness being an epidemic is that there's a lot of people who are experiencing this. So sometimes the fear is, if I invite people, what if nobody came, right? The fact that it's an epidemic confirms the fact there's a lot of people out there who are feeling lonely and would benefit from connection. So if you think, I can create a space, I can extend an invitation, you might want to explore that too. One thing to think of or consider is the idea of quantity versus quality, right? Again, personally for you, do you need a group of good friends? Do you need a best friend who knows everything about you? Do you need both? Would it be helpful to be vulnerable with strangers, right? And what I mean by that is there are opportunities to sort of, get involved with groups of people who are being vulnerable with each other, but they don't know each other before they walk in the room, whether that's a self-help group, a peer support group, or like sort of like a bonding retreat that organizations do, or something else, right? the key here is to be aware of what's going to be working for you, what you need, and not trying to copy what somebody else finds helpful. Another suggestion is to rekindle connections that have faded, right? So those old friends that we made, those structures that we used to be a part of, whether that be school or grad school, law school, my first job. As I've moved away, if I've lost connection with those friends, one thought is like, well, my life is different now. I'm not sure I have much in common with them. Or even family members, the same thing. My life is different now. Maybe I'm the only lawyer in my family. I don't have as much in common anymore. Rekindling those connections can be really effective. And you don't have to rekindle connections with the hope that they're going to meet all of your needs. Oftentimes it can be helpful, again, depending on what's personally relevant to you. It can be helpful to have multiple strong relationships where you can get one need met and perhaps another need met somewhere else. And finally, sometimes giving to others what you feel like you're in need of can be a really powerful experience. So whether that is like if you're feeling strapped for cash, donating some money to someone in need can often feel really powerful. With loneliness, extending kindness and compassion to strangers can often make it feel like you're connected to a greater good. You're creating a sense of connectedness in a community, right? Sometimes for some people, this can feel vulnerable. It's like, well, I don't know how to be kind to strangers. For another person, it's like, oh, this is really easy because like there's sort of no risk. There's no investment. I can just extend kindness to strangers. So that's something to consider as well. When you're feeling lonely, trying to offer connectedness or compassion to somebody else can often make you feel less lonely and more connected in general. And then again, spending intentional time trying to make those connections in your personal life to meet all of your needs is really important. All right, that was a lot of information. I apologize if that was overwhelming, but that's the end of my onslaught of information. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Shawn, that was so wonderful. A few things that stood out to me among a number of things, but one, that your physical health is so connected to this. Yes, it is mental health, but also the significance of physical health. Also, one thing that stood out to me when you were talking about strategies for connecting and finding people who have similar interests, there was or there is a website called Meetup, and this is a great website to go to because it does provide different avenues for people that want to connect based on their interests. And I will share that I actually connected specifically around pugs. For those that know me, I'm a big pug person. I have a pug. And so I found what was called a pug meetup. And the people that went, there were about 20 pugs running around. And these were people who were so dedicated and shared this interest specifically in pugs. So again, this website, it's travel, it's dogs, it's a variety of things. So that might be a good website to try. The other thing, you talked about extending kindness. And I wrote an article regarding volunteering. And it is really, I think, a nice way to build connections around something that people value, that you have that shared value. So a couple of things that that struck me that I wanted to mention. So I do want to open it up to any questions or comments. If any, I apologize, by the way, I was not able to turn off those captions, but I think we're okay. And I think it was helpful.
Yes, if
Probably for some folks.
my hang up was, I didn't know if I did that or I'm always concerned that if I'm not speaking clearly, the captions are going to be way off and confusing. So if that's helpful, by all means,
Yep.
use captions.
Excellent. So again, do we have any questions? I just wanted to, oh, we do. We have a question. Could you send us the slides? So yes, we will send you the recording as well as all the slides that go along with that. And somebody did ask, what is the website that I mentioned? It's called Meetup. So it's just MEET-UP. And again, I've gone on that numerous times because some of my friends don't always enjoy the things that I enjoy, which tends to be more adventurous types of different adventures like skydiving. Not everybody wants to do that. And so, again, I found that that was a great way to meet some of those folks that are willing to do a little more of that whitewater rafting or adventurous types of things.
I think that's just to put a point on that, Amy, I think it's a really good example that you could have a group of friends, right? It's like, oh, I've got friends, but like, we're not connecting on, a particular interest or a value that I have, right? Or I get along fine with my coworkers, and like, isn't that adequate? Sometimes like you could have people available to you that are just not meeting those relationship and connectedness needs. And it's important to sort of explore that particular need somewhere else. So I would encourage you not to feel sort of limited by what you currently have in terms of potential connections in relationships. Like, well, they might be great. Those friendships might be great, but you can also benefit from other connections.
Yeah, no, again, I appreciate that. I do have friends that I go to the movies with one particular friend, but she is not interested in some of these other more adventurous types of activities. So just wanted to mention, somebody said, thank you, excellent presentation. We do have another question. It says, dealing with the daily onslaught of emails and responding to them contributes to my feelings of loneliness. I try to call people instead, but often I feel like people prefer emailing. Do you have any suggestions?
Yes. Yeah, I think one that makes total sense of like constant emails and trying to keep up with them can definitely contribute to a sense of like, I'm not really connecting with people, right? I'm having these points of contact, but it's not meeting my needs. I know people who are like, oh, I'm a phone person, I'm a text person, right? Like I prefer this mode of communication. And I think I mean, obviously for you to feel connected to someone, ideally you want that same mode of connection that works for both of you. So if the people that you have contact with aren't sort of phone call people, but you are, it might be helpful to either encourage them to see like, oh, will this work for you, right? Can we have a phone call to see if that's a point of commonality? If it's not, I would suggest, looking for other connections, right? Looking for other potential relationships that could meet that need. Because again, if your whole world is people who, only respond if you text them, but you're not a texter, it's like, yeah, um, this doesn't feel authentic to me to be like typing out every thought. Then obviously a different type of interaction is going to be more meaningful. Easier said than done for sure. Like there's lots of barriers to that. But I would encourage you to be intentional about trying to explore those options, either with new people or with people that you have those connections with already, to see if, the mode that works for you might also work for them.
Shawn, I also wanted to mention that for those of us, we talked about there are many of us out there that work from home, and that can be isolating. And I think Shawn probably knows me by now that I am a very social person. And so what we did here at Lawyers Concern for Lawyers is that we designated 1 hour for a group of us to talk. It is remotely, it is through Teams, and just spend that hour every other week just talking about us and making connections there. No work is allowed to be talked about. And it is a way to maintain connection with your colleagues. And again, we brainstormed that, and we went to the executive director, who said, absolutely, that's a great idea. So for those of you that do work in remote teams, it's an idea to try to maintain a little bit more of a connection with your colleagues and not just seeing them on meetings and getting down to business. So I personally really enjoy it. I'm sure Shawn knows that. And so I think it is another way to maintain connections. And it was just a suggestion. And I think there are some employers out there that would be more than happy to do it. So if you don't do it now, make a suggestion at your own workplace. We have time for any other questions, comments, anything like that?
I see one in the Q&A.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yep. So it says, any specific advice for actions we can take while in the midst of loneliness when it's extremely hard to reach outside of oneself? I think it's a great question. Sort of going back to that idea that loneliness can sort of contribute to our mental health in a negative way. So when it feels like my loneliness is very significant, it's not just, I'm not feeling as connected to the house as I would like, but it feels like, no, this is actually pushing me down. This is like a burden that I'm not able to muster the energy to do these things that you're suggesting, because like all these suggestions, they take energy, right? So in those situations, my thought is it's helpful to sort of prioritize your immediate need, right? And then make a plan for the next step. So what I mean by that is, since sort of investing energy in these different suggestions to make connections, since that takes energy, what is that you need to sort of get a little bit of energy? And so one suggestion is to benefit from clinical support, right? Like talk to a therapist, talk to a lawyer's assistance program like ours. Just to get that support that you need to feel like, all right, now that some level of burden is lightened a little bit because I'm getting some support that I need. And then sometimes that level of support can be enough to feel like, all right, some energy is freed up, and now I can sort of make steps with the guidance of somebody else who's like sort of on my team and helping me sort of plan the next step of like, what can I do next to then, use this energy towards, improving my situation of loneliness. Where can I invest it? Where does it make sense for me to invest this, as opposed to just taking, there's 20 suggestions here. Like, what do I do with that? So again, to feel like, not to throw in a pun, but to feel like you're not doing it alone, right, is really important. And so if it feels like I don't have the energy or time to find someone so that I'm not doing it by myself, then sometimes a service like LCL or a therapist, a clinician can be really helpful, because like, all right, that's one level of connectedness, and then that can help you get to another level.
I have a question. I don't know, once again, if people know that, oh, by the way, comment, thanks for your suggestion regarding prioritizing outside care and support to get more energy. Energetic state. So I'm just also wondering, any studies, as you know, I am a pug person, as I've already announced, any studies that show that animals, cats, dogs, maybe birds, something like that, have an impact on loneliness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not prepared to give you citations, but there are a number of studies, like for years now, that have looked at the effects of relationships with animals, pets, pet-assisted therapy, things like that, where someone who is felt like disconnected and burdened and sort of like they don't have these connections can benefit from that unconditional acceptance that a pet or an animal can offer, right? Obviously, not all animals are good for this, but there are certain animals, particularly those with a temperament or sometimes those who are trained to work with people specifically around these issues. It can be really helpful. One, because uh, that level of sort of acceptance and vulnerability you can get interacting with an animal sometimes has less requires less from you, right? Sometimes it can feel like, oh, I can like spend time with a dog, with a horse, with an animal that I feel like, oh, this animal's connecting with me. I don't have to talk, right? They feel like there's some connection there and some vulnerability and safety there. And like that can then again meet a certain level of need that often gets me to the next, level of connecting with other people or other animals. And so I think that is a great suggestion as well as exploring, you know, that level of connectedness with animals can be super important and helpful.
And that just made me think, and that's great to hear. And for those of you that maybe do work longer hours and feel you can't take care of a pet, or you'll be out for a long time, when you do want a connection with animals, there's always volunteer opportunities at animal shelters. And so it's still a way to, one, you're connecting with people that share the same interest in being dedicated to dogs, cats, horses, but then also developing a connection with those animals there as well. They often need dog walkers and things like that. So I think these are all great suggestions and ways to make connections. I'm just checking to see if we have any other questions. I don't want to miss any in the Q&A. I don't see anything else. And I think again, for me, the pet piece is so important. And I do enjoy having Pickles around, although sometimes she can be a little disruptive to the meetings. Anyway, any other comments, Shawn, that you want to share?
Yeah, I think my one thought, or one additional thought, is sometimes people are sort of because loneliness is an epidemic, and people are aware that people are feeling disconnected and lonely. One question that I've gotten is like, how do I know if somebody else is feeling lonely? Like, how do I know like who to reach out to? And that can be challenging, right? Because for some people, they can be sort of like the life of the party, right? Really extroverted but also feel lonely, right? Because it is about that subjective sense of, do I have the level of connectedness that is meaningful and sufficient for me? And so for some, externally it's hard to tell. So my thought there is just to be more explicit about talking about it, right? Because it's an epidemic, right? It's not like there's one person in your life who might be lonely or one person in your world. Like, no, like a lot of people are feeling this at different times, at different degrees. And so my recommendation is to be talking about it more often and more explicitly. Maybe if you're comfortable, starting with like how you experience loneliness and like, how do you know when you're lonely versus when you're not, or what helps you? Mm-hmm. And back to Amy's comment about like trying to create spaces where you can talk, with people in your life, like coworkers, that it's not just about work. Maybe using those opportunities to bring up the topic and to have more explicit conversations about it, because I think that is what often helps, is when someone feels like, oh, someone's talking about an experience I'm having, I feel validated. I feel like maybe this is a safe place to start to talk about it and maybe sort of brainstorm about what would be helpful.
I think that's wonderful. And hopefully this did touch somebody, and people will reach out and take some action if they're ready and able. So thank you, Shawn, so much. This was once again a wonderful presentation by you. LCL is very lucky to have you again, celebrating your 10-year anniversary. So thank you all. We have one more. Oh, somebody said thank you. So again, we all appreciate it. And thanks for joining us. We do have a survey feedback form that if folks can fill out afterwards, that would be very helpful. It helps us understand what programming is needed and moving forward and being able to figure out again, what presentations really meet your needs. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day. And we will see you next month for another installment of webinars for busy lawyers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.